Hi folks, in this video I'm going to be looking at how I did the dilapidated wallpaper, the torn and faded posters and the wainscoting on this post-apocalyptic house. So without any further ado, let's cue the music. To start out, I have printed some wallpaper samples that I found online, and I've set them to the 9 photos on a page setting in Windows to get the right sort of scale for 28 to 32mm. And what I'm doing is I'm going to cut these out with some scissors, ready to glue these onto the MDF walls. With my pieces of wallpaper cut out, the first thing I need to do before even thinking about gluing is working out where they're going to fit and how they're going to fit together onto the actual building itself. This is especially important if you've got something like stripes or patterns, as you'll need to make sure that the pattern lines up and they don't look too weird sat next to each other. So here I'm taking the upper floor of Sarissa Precision's marshport house, and what I'm doing is I'm working out where these pieces of printed wallpaper are going to be, and if I need to do any trimming to cater for any overlapping textures. So to stick down our first piece of wallpaper, I'm taking some everyday PVA glue. You can use whatever brand you want. This is just cheap PVA glue from a craft store. I'm going to spread this out all over the back of the bit of the wallpaper, making sure that we cover every single little bit. And it doesn't matter if you want to thin this down or do it neat straight out the bottle, it doesn't really matter either way. Just make sure that you get a nice coverage over the wallpaper piece. We can then take this and place it into position onto the MDF wall, and I'm using the back of a paintbrush just to sort of smush this into place and get rid of any creases and folds that might appear when you press this down. Once the first sheet is in place, it is just a matter of going around all the walls, layering in all your pieces of wallpaper, and make sure you give them plenty of time to dry, and so they're not going to peel off when we go on to our next step. Once the wallpaper has glued in place, I'm then coming in with my trusty scissors and trimming off any of the excess bits of paper that are hanging over the edge of the wall. This is much easier if the wall is a straight piece and you're just cutting the tops off. It can get a bit awkward on more diagonal surfaces, but just take your time, and this is why it's really important that the wallpaper has dried onto the MDF to make this much easier to cut. I'm also using a hobby knife here to sort of trim away any of the bits that the scissors couldn't quite get to, and I'm not being especially neat with this, as the more aggressive we are with this and sort of tear little bits and chunks off, the more it aids that post-apocalyptic dilapidated feel. If the wall that you're detailing has windows in it, then we're going to need to cut the excess paper out from this, and this is why it's so good that we've used printer paper, as this is really easy to cut through with a hobby knife. And once this is dried very well in place, then it is very easy to just quickly cut through and just pull out bits of paper. And as we're going for a post-apocalyptic feel, you don't have to be too neat or worry if it tears or leaves a little bit behind. It's just going to help us aid in that weathered look. There's no real secret here, it's just a matter of taking your time and getting as close as to the edge as you can with your knife, and then pulling it away with your fingers or a pair of tweezers. Next, I'm going to be taking my hobby knife and I'm going to be cutting and chipping away at the bits of the wallpaper to create some tears and some bits that I can pull off down in strips to show where the wallpaper has rotted away over time. And you can do as many or as little as you want with these, and do not be neat with them, do not be surgical with them. The more that we can do a rough and natural looking erosion and tearing away and fading of this paper, the better this is going to look for your post-apocalyptic scenes. However, you do still want to leave some wallpaper left. It's very easy to go overboard with this. So what I recommend doing is doing 1 or 2 bits per wall, having a look at it, see what you think, and going back and doing any extra bits if you want. There's no exact science to this, it's just a matter of what feels right. Particular building that I'm doing is set in the Fallout universe, which has that 1920s to 1950s aesthetic. And so to really sell this, I'm going to be adding some wainscoting around the edge of the room. I have taken some craft sticks that I got from Hobbycraft, and I'm going to be cutting them down with my trusty scissors to the right length to fit along the edge of the wall. You might find that depending on the kit you use, you might have to use a couple of bits, but that's alright, especially if you sort of cut away and chip at the ends. It looks like you can make it look like it was one continuous piece that has sort of rotted away in places. But with this marshport house, they very nicely fit at one end. I'm going to be sticking these in place with a few blobs of super glue, as that's plenty strong, and then I'm just using something to tilt it back up so I don't get super glue all over my fingers onto the wallpaper and end up pulling bits of wallpaper off that I didn't want to. And then it's just a matter of going all around the rest of the walls along the bottom, adding this false wainscoting. And here's what it looks like once I've applied a craft stick all around the base of each wall. This is really easy to do and really helps sell that older 1920s to 1950s feel. To really sell that this post-apocalyptic house is from the Fallout universe, I've printed out a whole bunch of images that can be used as posters. And I'm going to choose one of these Nuka-Cola posters, and I'm going to be cutting out with a pair of scissors ready to be stuck to the upper walls of this marshport house. Now that I've got the little poster cut out, I'm going to be sticking it to the wallpaper in exactly the same method as I stuck the wallpaper to the MDF. So I'm going to work out just by hand roughly where I want to put it, and I think sticking it at this nice jaunty angle is really going to sell that abandoned vibe, and I'm going to be coating it in PVA glue. Whilst it's wet with the PVA glue, I'm then going to smush it into a rough place, and then I'm going to be using just my fingers to organise where I want it to be. If you want to give it that tattered, worn look, whilst it's still wet, you can fold over the corners and bits of the poster, with a brush that you're using to apply the PVA, and then coat it with a little bit of PVA just to ensure that the corner stays folded over and stuck down. So now we come to the messy bit, and that's to making this wallpaper and this wainscoting look like it's actually old. And to do this, I'm first coming in with some Wildwood contrast paint from Games Workshop, and I'm applying this all over the hobby craft sticks. This is working basically like a staining on the wood. The wood's going to soak up most of this, leaving a much darker finish behind. And this is going to give the illusion that the wainscoting is made from something a bit more fancy, like oak or mahogany. And that's just a matter of doing this neat out of the pot and going all the way around. Now, as you can see, due to the nature of the contrast, it's leaving the edges a little bit lighter, which lends to that faded look that we can really push for this wasteland house. And with this step, don't worry if you go onto the wallpaper and you put a bit of a splodge where you don't want it. In fact, that can actually help us. Rinse your brush off, and then with the wet brush, feather it out onto the wallpaper, and this will give us a lovely staining effect. And as we're going to come in and paint the floor later, you can be as messy as you want when it comes to the floor. Next, we're going to come in and actually start weathering the wallpaper. So, to start by this, I'm taking some neat contrast paint and putting a blob of where I want to run some streaks down from. I'm then rinsing the brush off, and with the wet brush, I'm then pulling down with the wet contrast paint. And as you can see, this is leaving behind a brilliant staining effect. And it's just a matter of putting a few blobs down, rinsing the brush off, and once again pulling down. And due to the nature of the contrast paint, it will soak very quickly into the print paper, so you've got to be careful to not get hard edges, but you can always just do a little bit at a time, add a few bits on, and just get this lovely brown staining rot and grime effect just by adding some contrast paint and then with a wet brush just pulling it downwards. And here I am doing exactly the same thing on the other wall of this house. You can thin the contrast paint right down to a very thin wash consistency, so it's basically brown paint water, and you can use this as more of a general staining effect, but I quite like the applying a blob and streaking effect. And I think it makes a real difference into making the wallpaper feel old. And with that, the upper floor of this marshport house is now complete, full with weathered wallpaper and dirty wainscotting, really selling it as part of the Fallout universe, and perfect for any other post-apocalyptic wasteland houses you might fancy making. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, why not consider subscribing? It's free of charge, it helps me out, and if you hit that bell, you get further notifications in your feed on further tutorials just like this one. And here you can see where I've done it on the other floors in the house using exactly the same effects but with different printed out wallpaper. So, until next time folks.